So I want to talk a little bit, I mentioned that the Committee to Protect Journalists has been around since 1981. It was founded by foreign correspondents who realized that they had an incredible amount of protection when they traveled abroad from being imprisoned or killed that their local counterparts did not. That dynamic has changed somewhat in recent years, but still we find that 9 out of every 10 cases we document are not international correspondents flying in on dangerous assignment. It is local journalists who are working day in and day out to report stories about the communities that they live in. And often stories that seem, from the outside, these aren't necessarily stories that are vying for Pulitzer Prizes or international awards or to be the big national security story of the year. These are stories about the fact that trash pickup isn't happening or that a local mayor took a bribe. But these are journalists who who believe that you should be able to tell those stories about your community and get them out there, and the price for that can be death. So 2 years ago, almost exactly, I was in Mexico as part of a delegation that was on an advocacy mission. CPJ has been very active in Mexico over the past decade. We've met with Presidents Fox, Calderon, and in 2017 we were meeting with Peña Nieto's administration. We didn't have a lot of illusions about Peña Nieto's administration. The amount of the violence in Mexico had increased dramatically. At least 39 journalists had been killed during his term. A number of organizations have a higher count than that. But we'd been engaged in direct advocacy. This is one of our tactics that we engage in and all around the world. And there had been some successes in Mexico. There was the creation of a federal protection mechanism. And we can talk a little bit more later about where that's been effective and where it hasn't. There was the creation of a special prosecutor for crimes against journalists, which has largely not been effective in solving cases. When we had this meeting, we met with the president. We were feeling relatively good about the advocacy mission, mostly because the special prosecutor for crimes against journalists who had done nothing was fired. So, we were feeling okay about the advocacy mission. And then a week later, we got the news that Javier Valdes had been murdered, and it hit really hard because he was such a close personal friend. He was a very close personal friend of my boss at the time, Carlos Lauria. He was a close personal friend of a number of people at CPJ, and he had received our award, our International Press Freedom Award. He'd come to New York. He'd been in our offices, and it was just, it was devastating. I don't think we even realized how bad it was. I mean, we were in emotional shock from that. It's come out in the past year that not only was Javier Valdes murdered, but within days after his murder, a malware was sent. A malware exploit was sent to his colleagues and to his grieving wife, Griselda. And this is a particular type of malware in Mexico called Pegasus that it's hard to describe how invasive it is. It takes over your entire phone. It can turn on your camera. It can turn on your microphone. It can observe basically anything that you do. It was the federal government, the Attorney General's office, that had the contracts for that malware. And so, the idea that the administration that we had just been meeting with 2 weeks before, the most famous journalist in Mexico dies, and all of his colleagues are getting this, are being surveilled. I think it's it's hard, it's hard to sort of overstate the crisis that Mexico is in, and the sort of cynicism that the government has had towards the press freedom crisis. Just to say some, we've already sort of talked about, Marcela talked about the number of journalists killed. Mexico is the deadliest country in the Western Hemisphere. It is the biggest client of Hacking Team, another sort of international corporation that sells surveillance software. It bought 500 licenses for the malware that was used against Javier's family. At least 25 of those we know have been used against civil society and journalists. The previous administration, we've talked about the most dramatic form of censorship, which is violence or murder, but there's often other forms of censorship as well. The previous administration spent around $2.5 billion in public advertising, much of which is can be used as a tool to pressure media outlets. If you don't publish favorable things, we'll take away your advertising contract and bankrupt you. We're now with a new administration. The administration of López Obrador was a cause of a lot of optimism, and we'll see what the legacy is when it comes to impunity, when it comes to violence against reporters. So far, 6 journalists have already been killed this year. And as Marcela said, there have been new challenges in terms of the relationship with the media and a tendency to sort of discredit critics of the media. But I think it is sort of a turning point in Mexico, and I think it's an important moment to have conversations like these about press freedom and how we move forward from what's been a crisis for more than a decade.
I would like to start with this one. This is for Marcela. And Marcela, tell us about your work with traumatized journalists. We know that you have helped to develop programs with therapies, and you are doing a great job helping these colleagues that have suffered emotionally for covering violence.
Yes, I don't know. I think like 5 years ago, it was the first time that I started realizing all the impacts of the violence in ourselves. When I was in Ciudad Juárez covering for my magazine, we always, the journalists, finish our day in a bar, like drinking, always talking. And in this environment, we always processing what happened that day. But sometimes some photographers start talking about the nightmares that they had. About, for example, one of them, he told me that one day he covered and he photographed 19 bodies in different crime scenes in 8 hours, no? And twice this same photographer was assigned to cover 2 different crimes, and the murderers, the dead people, one of them was his colleague, El Choco, Armando Rodriguez, and then the second time, Carlos Santiago, one young journalist was the other victim in another day, and he has to photograph for the newspaper. No? So, or the other testimony that I told you about this journalist who was waiting to be yes, to be kidnapped or that the cartels people came for him. So I start talking like how we can do to deal better with all these things. And first I asked help to that Center for Journalism and Trauma, and we organized one workshop in Mexico City, and we work like 20 journalists, I think, about from all around the country. And it was the first time that I saw that many of journalists feel guilty because they feel like toxic for the families, many who are mothers, like many journalists who are mothers, they feel like, oh, I am risking all my kids. I don't know if I am doing well or not, but I love my profession. Others say like, I can't, all the weekend I am only in the bed because I feel that I have not energy, I only want to drink. Other of these journalists say that he was tortured and he was kidnapped, and he never, in many years, he never said about that. So, and in different regions in Mexico, I always go to report, and at night we go to bars, and we always talk. And then I have not doing like a program or something, but I organize some workshops that how to deal with the victims of violence, how to approach them, but always the journalists start talking about their own grief, and then it's like I don't know, like a group of support, like everybody realized that we are not crazy, that we have the symptoms of PTSD, but the difference in Mexico is that we don't have like post-traumatic symptom, because it's the permanent symptom, because we have been many years covering this, so there is not a post. And yes, and the last workshop, for example, we try that is other that we organize for journalists who covered disappearance and mass graves, and I say, okay, I will bring a shaman to see what happened. Or sometimes we do some rituals, not religious, like indigenous, like limpias and things like that, to see how if the people feel safe or feel better. And I think we are like trying to create a community to protect each other, to help each other, and many times via WhatsApp. And we are like trying to be more supporting for the other journalists who are in Sinaloa or Tijuana or Guerrero, who are alone and who are covering all these things. So they just need to say something in the group that they are feeling something, and then immediately one of the group in another part of the country can call and like support and give some kind of first response. So I will love to have a strong program to really help journalists in this. And also in our last investigation, one of the rules was you have to go to therapy, and we organize a therapy group for all the journalists who were investigating one killing. And it was really interesting because in this therapy, I could know that the local journalists who were trying to investigate this specific killing, they feel all broke inside, and they feel really bad, and they feel fear of investigate, of publish whatever. So thanks to the therapy, I could notice that when you kill one journalist, the whole community is affected, and the people start start silencing themselves, because all the journalists feel fear, and they are really impacted. So that's what happened.
Have blogs or other social media become an alternative news source when traditional media doesn't report on violence or corruption? Could you give some examples, for example?
Yes, during the research work we've done, we have found a lot of social media reporting. Last week, a journalist was killed, Francisco Romero, who worked in Playa del Carmen, and he was the third reporter who was working for the same news outlet, which was a Facebook publication, Semanario Playa News. And after the murder of Rubén Pat and Guadalupe Chancib from the same outlet, he founded his own other media outlet on Facebook as well. We've also seen a lot of local reporters, some blogs, for example, Maximino Rodriguez in Colectivo Pericú, Rafael Murúa, who ran a Radio Comunitaria, but also wrote for a blog. We've also seen, well, for example, Elizabeth Macias, who tweeted about violence in Tamaulipas and who moderated another Twitter account. Her personal Twitter account has disappeared. There's definitely more examples, but I do think that the vast majority is local reporting. It's either reporters who founded their own publication, like the case of Javier Valdes with Rio 12, the case of Francisco Pacheco Beltrán with El Foro de Tasco, the case of Ricardo Monluí with El Político de Córdoba y El Político de Jalapa, the case of photojournalist Edgar Daniel Esqueda, who published his photographs in other outlets, but also founded his own outlet, Infórmate Potosino. So yeah, I would say that we have seen a lot of online reporting, self-found media outlets, and social media reporting.
Has the United Nations or other international organization asked the Mexican government to take action to protect journalists? This is a rhetorical question, obviously, but what's going on? How can you, for example, from the committee, hard work with the Mexican government, or how can we get results? Because Marcela pointed out about the impunity. This is a question about impunity. So how is it going on?
Yeah, I mean, there has been an incredible amount of international pressure on Mexico for results in cases of murders of journalists. The United Nations has spoken out about it. It is one of the biggest sort of causes of the EU in their work in Mexico. It has been, especially under former Ambassador Roberto Jacobson from the United States to Mexico, was a central point of focus. But I think you can also look at how the Mexican government responded to the International Commission in Ayotzinapa. And it hasn't necessarily led to direct results. One thing I think would be worth sort of flagging is, there's obviously international solidarity and pressure at the political level. And again, most of this is pressure. This is diplomatic pressure. There's not, there aren't heavy sanctions attached. I mean, there's some amount of money that the U.S. has an aid initiative to Mexico that's tied to human rights, but it's really not. I mean, it's not influential in any. And so I think, the carrots and sticks also haven't been enough to maybe make the Mexican government react. But there's also the sort of international solidarity that Marcela was talking about, that Javier Valdes talked about in the video, which is the solidarity from international media as well. And one of the things that, that I think maybe there's a little bit more of now, I'd be interested to hear from Marcela, but has often been lacking, is if you're a reporter doing one of these stories and it just goes in your local newspaper, nobody's going to investigate your murder, nobody's going to make a fuss if you disappear. But if the international media is picking up stories of mass graves, if they're picking up stories of corruption, it can create sort of a protective network.
How do you see the future of journalism and journalists in Mexico, but also here? Because, for example, Marcela is covering in Mexico, but Alejandra is a Mexican covering in New York. For example, she's covering the Chapo Guzman trial in the Brooklyn court. So, and now Marcela mentioned it before that with the current president of the United States, also the journalists and journalism is at risk, at least in the public opinion about the free of speech. So, how do you see the future of the journalists?
Even all these years with all these attacks and many journalists killed, I think the Mexican press is doing yes well. I feel proud of what we are doing, and we continue investigating. And I think in the last years, it has been really good years in investigative articles and projects, and we also learn how to collaborate with other journalists and all these things about creation our own networks or our own collectives, even if there are 3 or 10 in Chiapas or in Guerrero or in Tamaulipas, but every time that when a colleague is killed, and when we convoke, like, let's do something, and it's like beautiful because you start seeing in the internet that people from the town that we don't know, some journalists are protesting in that city, and we have many journalists trained or connect among them. Because if somebody is threatened, other journalists in their own city know how to, what to do, who to call, asking for help, how to connect with CPJ or Article 19 or with the government. And I think that we are like learning how to take care of this, as we know that the government won't, never will protect us, that we can develop some ways to protect among us and to peer, and so, and also we see many collaborative work also with American journalists or with journalists from another countries in Latin America. So I don't know, that I think that even with all this, the Mexican press is alive, and that we have things to even to teach other journalists who are living conflict, in context of conflict, as the Colombians teach us when we ask for help. The Colombians came to Mexico and start like training us. So I think that now, when in Nicaragua or even in Venezuela, when they ask like how would you have to survive, we say, okay, we don't know, but we have explored this, or in emotional care we can do this, or with these collaborative investigations or things like that. So that I think that we will survive, and I hope that one day we can have justice, and that because the impunity is an invitation to silence more journalists. So one day, if we can have justice, this can stop these killings and all these threats and all this environment can stop. But now it has been really difficult.
That's it, and I think that it does boil down to the impunity problem. And one thing that made me hopeful was during the 2nd anniversary of Javier's murder, I think this was unusual. I don't know, maybe Marcela will have something to say about this, but to have the prosecutor for crimes against journalists present at an event which was specifically about the murder of Javier. And to address the public in that sense, I think has been a great triumph of nonprofit organizations and advocacy work. And I think that is sort of unprecedented, no? And that, although the murders remain unsolved, I think those are steps in the right direction. And while there are a few reasons to be hopeful, I remain hopeful as well.
Many of the crises confronting journalists are bigger than just the sort of the piece that press freedom organizations take on. I mean, I think in Mexico, a lot will depend on whether Mexico can solve its broader problem of violence and impunity. And I think in Mexico, in the United States, and all around the world, there are many challenges to press freedom, but there's also this challenge of a business model. That there's less and less of a press to defend in many state houses, in many local communities. Then when it comes to press freedom, there are new challenges. There's online harassment, there's social media, there's the ways that rhetoric at the highest levels trickles down and can sort of inspire lone wolf actors like we saw in the Capitol Gazette shooting in the United States, or bomb threats sent to the offices of CNN. So it's, I think it's easy to see all of these problems and feel like they are too big. But that is also really unfair, because you see all the time stories that lead to real changes in people's lives, that lead to policy changes, that uncover that in Flint, Michigan, the water was poisoned, that uncover, massive corruption, and that really save lives, save communities, and journalists have been incredibly creative. And there's this incredible human urge, I think, to be able to report and write about what's happening around you. And I don't think that is going anywhere. And so seeing, all around the world where we work, I have colleagues who cover, every region of the world, and all of them have sort of a different story of, okay, now people are trying this, there's this new network, there's this new initiative, there's this new sort of platform, and the number of sort of innovations and the amount of resilience that we see is really impressive.
Hi, first, thanks for a great program. Ms. Torati, thanks for your courage, and the rest of you for your work. At first, I had wanted to ask about the complicity of the U.S. government, but something Ms. Ellerbeck brought up is where I'd like to direct my question. I'd like to know about this malware. I'd like to know how you all discovered it, how it's being used, and the source of it, and whether that source has any connections back to the U.S. government or former U.S. government officials.
Yeah, so we did not discover it. A lot of this work was done, a lot of the work on this malware, which is owned by a company called NSO Group, was done by a Canadian organization called Citizen Lab, which does forensic research into the use of malware, particularly against human rights workers and civil society. And they worked in conjunction with a digital rights group in Mexico called R3D, R3D, and Article 19 in Mexico to unearth cases in Mexico of journalists who had been targeted. There's no link to the malware itself. There's no direct link to the U.S. government or to any other government in the creation of the malware. It was owned by a U.S. company called Francisco Partners. It is in the process of being sold So it's up for sale right now, and there are a number of, prominent U.S. financial firms that have invested in it. So there is somewhat of a U.S. connection there. The NSO Group itself is an Israeli company. They sell directly to, they only sell to governments. They say that they have robust human rights vetting. They did sell to Saudi Arabia. I'm sure you're all familiar with the case of Jamal Khashoggi. One of his, a collaborator of his, who was living in Canada, a Saudi civil rights activist living in Canada, was targeted directly, which likely could have allowed the Saudi government to intercept conversations that he was having with Khashoggi at the time.